Today I'm going to show you how I created this mountainscape from watercolors. Okay, so for this I'm going to use a wet and wet technique. It's shown speeded up here in the background, but when it comes to it I'm going to show the process in real time and explain the steps, why I'm taking those steps, and a bit about how to control paint when working wet and wet. Okay, so a quick rundown of the materials you need. I've got 2 glasses of water, I've got my watercolour paint which is Paynes grey, I've got a couple of brushes, flat watercolour brushes, as well as a medium-sized round brush, and the paper I'm using is Archer's cold pressed fine grain. I'm just going to tape the sides to stop the wet paint going over the edge of the paper. Okay, so now I'm going to cover the paper in water with a clean brush. I have speeded this part up, but I am taking my time because I want to make sure that the water is evenly spread and there's no pools of water. Okay, so now I'm going to take some quite watered down paint and I'm going to draw the shape of 2 mountains roughly on the paper. I'm using a medium-sized flat brush, holding my brush towards the end and making that line continuous as I do the tops of the mountains, with just a few variations in it to make them look a bit more interesting. And then underneath I'm going to do a kind of reflection. I'm working wet and wet, so the edges of the mountains have a soft, not hard edge. But the paper's not soaking wet, so it means that once I've painted in the forms of the mountains, they do more or less keep their shape, although the paint will continue to get pulled across the paper to a certain extent. Now you might notice that the shape of these mountains is quite a bit more exaggerated than the mountains that I ended up with. That's because I'm going to flatten some of them out. I find this is a good way to do these paintings because if I don't exaggerate the shapes at the beginning, then I find that sometimes they can get lost and the result can be quite a flat landscape. But obviously there's room for experimentation here and you could try out different forms depending on the type of effect that you're trying to achieve. Okay, so now I've got less watered down paint and I'm drawing some shapes in the foreground, sort of slightly flatter mountains. And I'm still working wet and wet, so the edge of that form is also a softer edge. Now the paper is still wet, so I'm not having to work super fast, and I'm showing this in real time because I want to show how I need to give the paint a chance to move into the paper, and I'm waiting to see what it does and where it moves, and then I'm adding darker colour as I go, and that band of darker will expand and move up and down the page because it's wet, so I need to wait and see what's going to happen with that. Okay, so now I'm going to put some water on my brush and just run it across those mountains because they're feathering out quite a bit, and that will just soak up some of the excess paint, but I don't want my brush completely dry because I don't want to put too much of a hard edge there. Now at the moment I'm not sure exactly which of the mountains I'll flatten out, so I'm just keeping my options open. But even if you do end up flattening them out, I think it helps to have that form of the mountain behind because there's a very subtle shadow of it might show through anyway, and that can just help the composition. So this kind of fairly careful control of the forms when working wet and wet is important because the paint does tend to move around quite a lot when using this method. Now working wet on wet in this way is more tricky than working wet on dry, and if you're a beginner and you're looking for an easier tutorial, then I've got another one where I create a mountainscape using a wet on dry technique, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Okay, so this middle band is feathering out quite a lot and I don't want to have too much of a feathered edge, so I'm getting my paintbrush there and I'm running it along the edge to soak up some of that water, which just smooths it out a bit. Okay, so now it's time to flatten out some of the mountains. So I've got water on my brush and I'm just running it across the surface of the painting. Now that's just blending that mountain more into the background. And you can still make out the outline of it, which is giving a nice form to the mountain at the bottom, and I'm going to do the same at the top. But I'm only doing this to the one on the right hand side. I'm going to leave the one on the left how it is. Now, because this paper has started to dry quite a bit now, I'm putting quite a lot of water on just to help to blend that paint into the paper. And I'm going to put more dark paint in the middle again. Watercolour always dries lighter than when it's wet, and also because that band is expanding across the paper, it is getting lighter for that reason as well. So I need to make sure that that middle band does stay dark because I want to have a good contrast within the painting. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit more blending at the bottom with water on my brush. Now when you're working wet in wet and you're trying to control the paint on the paper, you need to make sure that your brush isn't too dry and it isn't too wet. If it's too dry, it will just soak up all the paint, and if it's too wet, then you'll end up putting too much water onto the paper, and that water will start to move across the page. Now I always keep a few of these cardboard frames or mats so that when I'm working I can use it as a kind of viewfinder to crop the painting. I don't have a bigger one for this painting, and I think I will crop it a bit larger than this, but it's quite a useful thing to have on hand. So here I was contemplating putting more dark down, but I decided against it in the end. I decided that the painting was finished. I do think that part of the process of working with watercolours is to know when to stop. You don't want to overwork your painting too much. You want to keep that sort of spontaneous look, and also if you work too much into the painting you can start to lift off the paint, and then that can get really tricky, so it's best to avoid that, and you just want to stop before you get to that point. If you do give this technique a go to create something that looks similar to this or something different, I would really love to hear about it, so please leave a comment below. And now, as you can see, I didn't flatten my paper and it's buckled now, so I will need to flatten it. Now if the painting was smaller, I could spray the back and put a book on top of it, that would flatten it, but because it's quite a large painting, I'm going to use a different method where I use tape, and I have got another video that shows this process from start to finish. I'm putting it in the background here, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. Okay, so I really hope you have enjoyed this video and it's been helpful. This original painting is available on my website. I'll put a link in the description. And I also have prints in the same style or similar style. Here's a screenshot of the page on my website, so you can head there if you want to get a print as well. Okay, so if you did try out the tutorial and you want to share your results, or if you've got any questions, please do leave a comment. And if you want to see similar videos in the future, then please subscribe to my channel. Okay, thank you, bye.